Welcome to the Manders Mindset podcast. Here you'll find both monologue and interviews of entrepreneurs, coaches, healers, and a variety of other people, where your host Amanda Russo will discuss her own mindset and perspective and her guest mindset and perspective on the world around us. Manders and her guests will help explain to you how shifting your mindset will shift your life.
Welcome to Manders Mindset, where we explore the power of shifting your mindset to shift your life. Today, I am joined with Bruce, and he is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 30 years. And I am so excited to delve down his journey, the 3 books he has written, and all about his experience as a couples therapist. Thank you so much for joining me, Bruce.
Well, thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
Me too. So who would you say Bruce is at the core?
I've heard you ask that on podcasts, and there are several cores of me. So, I don't think there is just one. And one thing I will sometimes describe myself as a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. So that's, I'm definitely on the nerdy side of things. My wife, Judy Alexander, and I do a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. There's a little plug there. And we'll sometimes say, well, I'm the therapist. She's the real person. She's a retired educator. She's worked with people a lot too, but she's not a therapist. So she will sometimes, if we're interviewing a guest or something and the guest and I start nerding out on sort of, psychological jargon or something, she will pull us back into speaking to real people. I'm a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. And I'm also at core, it's funny, at core, I'm a musician. I've done music my whole life. And there's something about the work I do as a therapist that is really about my core, because I used to do stuff that I was okay at and had fun doing, but it wasn't really who I was. And it wasn't until I got into this that getting into, working with people in this way that really felt like, oh, this is who I am. So that's part of who I am as well.
I love that. So you really felt like you were embodying what you're meant to do, being the couples therapist.
Yeah, and it took me a while to get there. Now, I don't know if your podcast is anything like ours. Way more people hear it than see it. I know you do have some stuff on YouTube, but anyway, people looking, they'll say, oh, he's an old guy. Well, yes, I am. I mean, I'm 74. If you do the math, and you mentioned I've been doing I've been a psychologist for 30 years in private practice. And so I was already in my 40s when I got into it. So I was doing other stuff. I used to be a statistician way back in the day, and I was teaching courses in data communications. Back when you could say that, it was like a discrete field. Now it's like there's so many different subspecialties of that. But, I used to do all that stuff. But it was when I went through some issues actually in my first marriage. My current marriage is the second marriage for both of us. And going through the loss of that first marriage, which took a long time to happen. The short story of my first marriage is that both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's basically what happened there. But it took a while for her to figure that out. So that's what she needed. And I make light of it, but it was actually very painful. And it got me exposed to being in therapy, both individual and also couples. And some of the therapy I had was really good. And some of the therapy I had, I look back on now, from the standpoint of experienced therapist, and realized, wow, some of that was really bad. It really wasn't, borderline unethical in cases, but whatever. But I learned from all of it. And there was something about the power of it that I just felt like, wow, I really want to be doing this. And so I started getting my training in my late 30s, and didn't get licensed, as I said, until I was into my 40s.
Now, I'd love if we could backtrack even more a little bit. If you could take us down memory lane a little bit, childhood, your upbringing,
Yep.
However deep you want to take that. Could be as simple as, like I tell guests, I'm an only child. So even if you hear nothing else, like, it tells you a little bit about how we got to 25.
Yeah. Well, I am the third son of a third son, and my father, was a third son. I am a third son, all boys in these families. And guess what? I ended up having 3 boys. So I that married into 2 stepkids. So I finally acquired a stepdaughter. That was really nice to have. Although they were already pretty well fully baked by the time I married their mom, so I don't get credit for them, but they're wonderful. But so my youngest is a third son of a third son of a third son. But that's somehow mystically important. I don't know why. So I'm very much not an only child. I'm the little one. I believed for decades that most men are taller than me. I'm of average height, maybe a hair above average. I'm certainly not particularly short, but I always believed that most men are taller than me because I was the youngest of three boys and my brothers were always taller than me. So that's sort of what I figured. So I grew up in Buffalo, New York, was very much a part of the Jewish community in Buffalo, New York, and that's extended throughout the rest of my life. I'm very active in the Jewish communities wherever I've lived, sometimes in leadership roles and often in musical roles and things like that. And what else should I tell you? I already mentioned I used to be a statistician for a while. In fact, I actually have 4 books out, and somebody actually bought the statistics book I wrote in 1986. Somebody bought that recently. But anyway, so I used to do that way back in the day.
So how was school for you as a kid growing up? Were you the nerd growing up as well?
I was something of a nerd. And it was interesting because I skipped 3rd grade, and it was me and 2 other boys. They skipped us all. We didn't know it until we showed up for school, and they said, "You're not going to go into 3rd grade. We want you to try 4th grade." And so I was the youngest of those three of us that skipped. So I was always the youngest kid in my class all the way through school, starting from 4th grade on. And that, on the one hand, it spared me a year of school that I think I would have been pretty bored in terms of the material. On the other hand, I was behind socially all the way through school because I was a year younger than everybody else. And so particularly middle school, early high school years, especially 7th, 8th grade, around there, very painful because I was just younger than everybody else. So that was difficult. But I think back, was it a good idea to do? And, there were some positive things, but also some negative, and certainly it didn't come up with our kids. They weren't doing that when our kids were going through school, and I wouldn't have done it. Based on my own experience, I wouldn't have done it. But I was kind of a nerdy kid. It wasn't until actually when I got into high school, I established myself as something of, they made me editor of the high school newspaper at the end of my sophomore year. And then I got heavily political. This was back in the days of the Vietnam War. I graduated from high school in 1968, which was an incredibly tumultuous year. And I sort of established myself as like politically active and, organized a citywide school. We were going to do a teach-in back in the day. But anyway, back in the day. And actually it never came off because the day we had scheduled it was the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so they canceled school and we canceled that event, but we did have it organized. So, when I went to my 50th high school reunion back in 2018 and saw folks that I hadn't thought about in 50 years, never mind, seen in 50 years, but a lot of them were reminding me of that. Oh yeah, boy, you were involved in all that, political stuff.
Wow.
So post-high school, I ended up graduating from the University of Toronto in Canada. My major was East Asian Studies. My specialty actually was Japanese. I also studied Chinese. While I was at it, I also took Russian because I was just fascinated with languages. I have never visited either China or Japan, but I was so fascinated by languages, specifically the different ways that different languages make you think. There's it's not just they have different words for stuff and different word order. It's that it's a whole different way of thinking. And Japanese is about as different from English. Chinese, I think, is a lot easier for an English speaker to learn than Japanese. But I was just fascinated by it. So one of the things in my last year of college was worked with my Japanese professor on translating some stories. And because he needed help translating into English, he spoke English, but he spoke English way better than I spoke Japanese, that's for sure. But he wanted some help from a native speaker of English, and I had studied Japanese with him. So that was really an interesting experience.
Now, did you have any plans of doing anything like with this East Asian studies? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I thought for a while I was going to go to Japan to study. And ended up, what happened was my then wife, my first wife and I, and we were very young when we got married. We were 20 and 19 when we got married. So we were still in school when we got married. We ended up right after I graduated and she was going to go, she had one more year to go. But we ended up coming to Vermont where she had a sister. And we were hiking on the Long Trail. And you live in Massachusetts, so you might have heard of the Long Trail, not all of it, but part of it is part of the Appalachian Trail. So we were hiking along during the summer, and we sort of stumbled into jobs as caretakers at one of the lodges on the Long Trail, which was a job that just involved kind of cleaning up, being a presence so that people didn't trash the place, cleaning up, doing a little bit of trail clearing work, stuff like that. So we did that for that summer and decided during that summer, that was the summer of 1972, we did not want to go back to Toronto. We wanted to move to Vermont. So I ended up getting a job as a taxi driver in Barrie, Vermont, which lasted all of 2 days because I made so little money, there was no way I could possibly live on it. And I ended up applying to the state of Vermont and got a job working for the state of Vermont as what do they call it? Personnel research technician. It just meant it was a section in the personnel department that was doing test validation, because that was right around the time that there was a court case that said that if you had selection procedures for jobs, you had to prove that they were valid. If they had any sort of discriminatory impact, you had to prove validity. So there sprung up this small industry of people working for state governments and city governments, places like that, working on validating their selection procedures. So I was involved in that, and the head of that section left a year or two later, and they made me the head of that section. And I convinced the state of Vermont they should send me for a master's degree in statistics, because I was using all these statistics that I didn't really know much about. And they sent me, and I took one course, and it turned out they were looking for somebody to work at the University of Vermont as a statistician programmer. So I left the state of Vermont, ended up there. And that's how I was able at the University of Vermont to get my master's degree in statistics and then later a PhD in psychology without having to pay tuition, because I was a full-time employee of the university. So that it worked out very nicely.
Wow. Okay. Now, I'm curious. You said your master's in statistics and then your PhD in psychology. What was the timing between those?
Yeah. So I got the master's in statistics in, what was that, 1977, 78? I think 78. And took a year off after that. I was still working for the university. And they did not have a PhD program in statistics. And I wanted to go on and get a doctorate. But they had one in psychology that would use all of my, on the research side, not on the clinical side, that would use all of my credits for my master's. I had worked actually with some professors in the psych department on my master's in statistics. One of my jobs when I was a statistician was as a statistician at the Vermont Regional Cancer Center. And they were doing research testing to see whether nurse home visits would improve the quality of life of patients with advanced cancer. And to do that, they had to find some way of measuring quality of life. So I did my master's thesis on how might one measure quality of life in patients with advanced cancer, and did a lot of research on that. And that involved a fair amount of statistics. And so I worked with the psych department. And so they said, well, come get a PhD with us. And of course, because I was a university employee and they didn't have to give me I was cheap. So that they let me in, it was great. So that's how I got my PhD in psychology. I didn't get the clinical training until a few years later. So the PhD in psychology was 1982. So I guess it was 4 years after the master's degree. I had to do, it took me about that long between that and the dissertation I wrote and all that stuff. So I didn't get the clinical training I didn't start getting clinical training until almost 10 years later. And that had to do with what was going on in my marriage. And so I didn't go back and retake courses, but I got clinical training through internships and supervised practice and all that stuff. Ended up getting licensed as a psychologist doctorate by the state of Vermont.
Wow. Now, also, that sounds like such a fascinating project that you did at the end, how one measures the quality of life.
Yeah. It was interesting. And what I remember about it was it's not a unidimensional phenomenon. That's what and was studying some of the research that was done by the National Opinion Research Center and folks who've studied happiness and satisfaction and things of that sort. The stuff that makes us happy, let me put it this way, the absence of the stuff that makes us miserable is not what makes us happy. In other words, there's stuff that can make you miserable, right? Being sick and in pain and, not having enough money and all the sorts of things you could imagine could make somebody miserable. By golly, it's pretty effective for a lot of people in making them miserable. But if you remedy that, which is a wonderful thing to do, that doesn't necessarily make people happy. It just makes them less miserable. The things that tend to make you happy can make you happy even if you're also miserable. In other words, they're not exactly orthogonal, as we would say nerdily. They're not exactly completely unrelated, but neither are they perfectly related. So it's different stuff that makes you happy than stuff that makes you not miserable.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I bet it was fascinating, though, what you found from that.
It was interesting work. Yeah, it's funny. I was just over on my shelf. I have a copy of my PhD dissertation, which was heavily statistical. That one wasn't particularly psychological at all. My PhD in psychology was heavily statistical. My master's degree in statistics was heavily psychological. And I must have it somewhere else in the house, but I haven't looked at my master's thesis in a long time.
You had mentioned about your first marriage. How did that, or maybe even when did that start to come to an end for you?
It took a long time to come to an end. The sort of crisis mode happened when we'd been married for close to 18 years, I think. It was going to look back on it now and, easy to see in hindsight, there were signs I might have detected, but I didn't know to detect them, nor did my ex, by the way. I think she knew a lot more about it than I did, obviously. But I was quite willingly somewhat clueless. I didn't really want to see the signs. In a lot of ways, we got along very well. And then there were ways we didn't. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that, partly because that's not only my business, it's also my ex's business. It took a long time for, what happened was when we finally figured out, or really she finally figured out that she was gay is basically what happened. When she finally figured that out definitively, was willing to tell herself, and you got to realize she's about my age. She's like 6 months younger than me. She's also in her 70s now. This was happening when she was, 20s, 30s, 40s. And our generation has had a much harder time with that than yours does. And so it took a lot of courage for her to be able to figure out what she needed to figure out and actually face it. I remember the moment actually. Said, oh my God, we're going to have to divorce, which was really painful because we'd been married at that point for 30 years and 3 kids. Now our youngest was almost ready to graduate from high school, which made things a lot easier. So, we waited to actually file for divorce until we didn't have to worry about custody issues. We weren't going to fight about it, but we didn't have to worry about it. Our youngest was already 18 when we divorced. But that took a long time. And it wasn't until we had a really good story that then we could know what to do. And by good story, I simply mean a story that said, neither one of us is broken. The problem here isn't that you're broken or I'm broken. The problem is, we're incompatible in some really important ways. And so we're going to have to sadly and lovingly split up. And that's basically what happened. So it was ridiculously short time after we separated that I met my now wife. The kind of thing that I routinely, and anybody in my line of work, there are probably people who don't say this, but most of us say, oh my goodness, don't immediately get involved with someone else, right after you've just separated. I wasn't even divorced yet. But my now wife I just happened to check out J-Date, the Jewish dating thing. This was happening in the early 2000s. This was in 2003. And, dating services, like Match.com was already in existence in those days. Well, J-Date was one for people who are looking for Jewish people. So, and I was heavily Jewish, and I knew if I was going to find anyone, she would have to be a Jewish woman. And mostly because I knew that nobody else would tolerate me being who I am. It was kind of like that. But she had managed to post on JDate, and she'd been divorced for years at that point, and she wasn't even checking JDate anymore, but her profile was still there. Well, she put her profile, and the one phrase on there that was pretty well designed to attract me out of all the Jewish men in Vermont. And I'll tell you what the phrase was, and for those of your listeners who are Jewish, maybe we'll get it and maybe won't. The phrase was an Eshet Chayil, but a woman of today. So why did that attract me in particular? Well, you have to know what an Eshet Chayil is. That's a quote from Proverbs. Eshet Chayil means a woman of valor, but it's a particular quote. It's what traditionally is sung on Friday at the Friday evening meal. It's sung in praise of the Jewish wife. It's very, very old-fashioned stuff. And if she had just said an Eshet Chayil, I would have said, oh, no, I think she's more religious than I am. She's more observant than I am. But she said, a woman of today. And I'm saying, that sounds interesting. And so then, we arranged to meet, again, way sooner than I ever would have thought. And so I wrote to her when I saw her profile. I said, all right, I'll write to her. All right, just to see. This is just so intriguing. And I said, last time, she lived in Burlington. I lived in Montpelier, about 40 miles apart. Montpelier is the capital. Anyway, so I lived in Montpelier, part of a little tiny Jewish community there. She was in the big city of Burlington, population 50,000, depending on whether UVM is the University of Vermont's in session or not. But anyway, she was the education director at one of the synagogues in Burlington. So didn't have her name there. So I wrote and said, well, gee, last time I was in Burlington happened to be for the performance of a cantata that I wrote with a music group I was part of. And I'd written this, hour and 10-minute long cantata, my magnum opus. And she wrote back and said, wow, I was there and I love the music. And so I thought, well, okay, if you know the Yiddish word beshert, that means foreordained. It's like, okay, this match was foreordained. And then we met and hit it off. And turned out she had a background astonishingly similar to mine in many ways. She used to lead services in her little community when she lived in southern Vermont. She teaches kids. She's a Jewish educator. We meshed right away. So I covered a lot of history there.
No, wait. That's beautiful, though. And now I'm just personally curious. You said she didn't have a photo. So did you see what she looked like before you sent her a message or no?
No. And it's interesting because I didn't have a picture either, wow. And we didn't care. And she happens to be, in my humble opinion, beautiful. So, and when I fell in love with her, she became, with all due respect, the most beautiful woman on earth. So, that sounds kind of smarmy, but that is kind of how it worked. No, neither one of us was particularly worried about that. We weren't, neither one of us is all that visually oriented. You know how people are some people are more visual, some people are more sound. She's more visual than I am. I am not particularly visual. But as soon as I got to know her, I fell in love with how she looked and everything else, Mm-hmm. So I'm always fascinated by people who sort out people based on how they look, like swiping right or swiping left. It's like, wow, maybe that works sometimes. I kind of doubt it, but maybe it does.
No, I agree with that. You know nothing about their mindset, even if they look decent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, that seems so much like fate to me because you really didn't know much. You can see what she looked like. You saw one quote. That seems like fate to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it had enough information. I knew I wanted a woman who had kids herself because I have kids. And in fact, not only did I want a woman who had kids herself, I wanted a woman who, if it came to a choice between me and the kids, would pick the kids. I didn't ever want to come between somebody and her kids. And I, of course, didn't want her to come between me and my kids. I mentioned I'm working on a book. I might as well mention what that's about. This next book I'm working on now, it's a workbook. It's not spiral bound and, where you write on the book. You have to write on your own paper. But it has lots and lots and lots of questions and then lots of suggestions and things like that. It's a workbook. And the title, I haven't got the subtitle for sure yet. I'll give you what the subtitle idea is, but the title is The Passion Paradox. And the subtitle is When You Feel Miles Apart and Still Love Each Other. And so it's for people who feel miles apart but still love each other. In other words, for people where they're feeling like, wow, we used to have this wonderful sense of both stability and intimacy. Those are the two needs I talk a lot about. And somehow something's gone wrong. And maybe we've got lots of stability, but no intimacy. And I don't just mean sex. I mean, more generally, no emotional intimacy. Every once in a while, I'll meet a couple that has intimacy, like they might have sex, but no stability. But the vast majority of folks I work with, it's the other way around. And so this is a workbook for those people. I'm writing a section now dealing with step-parenting issues. And I did a little quick Google just to see what are people telling step-parents out there. And I came across a couple of really interesting threads on Reddit where they were talking about, people were saying, if you don't have kids yourself, don't do it. Don't marry someone with kids. I don't make blanket statements like that, but they're saying that it can be so difficult, and for both parties, it can be so difficult to understand what that's like and to recognize, parenting and step parenting and you usually aren't the same. Remember the Brady Bunch?
Do.
That has done horrible things to people's expectations about what a blended family is all about. And, if you remember the Brady Bunch, it's like, there was no evidence of the previous parents ever existed. I think the boy's mother had died. I think that might've been some passing reference to that. I have no idea what happened to the girl's father, but whatever it was, they presented it as if it's just all one big happy family and there's no issues around that. And that tends to be, shall we say, unrealistic. If I was before I would even date someone, I wanted it to be a woman in the ballpark of my own age. She just made the cut, it turned out, because at the time I was 51. And so J-Date's categories and went 45 to 55. So that was, I wanted somebody in my age category. I want somebody who would get the same references, the same cultural references. She was 45 at the time. She's 6 and a quarter years younger than I am. So she fortunately just made the cut, or I wouldn't have seen her profile. Yeah.
Now, I'd love if we could transition back to when you first started doing therapy and working as a couples therapist.
Yep.
How did the beginning of that go for you?
It was fascinating. I got trained a number of different really, really valuable experiences as an intern. And my first experience as an intern was doing very heavily psychodynamic work. I won't get into all the weeds of what that means. I knew I needed to get out of that the day when I realized I don't want to think of people the way you have to think of people to do psychodynamic work. This is a caricature, but the classic psychodynamic explanation for when the client arrives for the session, if they arrive early, they're compulsive. If they arrive early, they're anxious. If they arrive late, they're resistant. If they arrive on time, they're compulsive. It's like, oh, okay. So I don't want to think of people that way. It's just everything is pathologized. It seems I'm sure that's an unfair characterization, but anyway, so I got trained in family therapy, and that also included some training in couples therapy. Did an externship in New York at the Ackerman Institute for Family Therapy, and was just fascinated by that whole process. And so when I finally got my license and went into private practice, I was seeing individuals, I was seeing couples, I was seeing families. The longer I did it, the more I was drawn to couples work. Just found there was something so compelling about it. I don't have a better explanation than it just felt really inspiring. And I learned so much from the people I worked with. I think most therapists would probably say this. We learn more from the people we work with than from any of our training, even if it was good training. I did get a lot of good training, but real people is where you learn the skill. And so the longer I did it, the more I started specializing in couples work. And it was probably 8 or 10 years ago, I think, I just stopped taking individuals entirely, and I just accept couples now as new clients.
So it's only couples you work with now.
So it's funny, if you ask various therapists, they're the therapists who will say, oh my God, I don't touch couples with a 10-foot pole. And then there are the therapists who say, no, I love working with couples, and I'm one of them. So I will tell you, this is sort of connected to that. Like, what was it like to get into that? I mentioned my wife and I do a podcast. We've been doing that for 5 years. We started right at the time that first book about couples therapy came out, Reigniting the Spark. it came out on February 29th, 2020. Well, gee, what was happening right around February 29th of 2020? The pandemic broke out. So we couldn't do any in-person promotional events. So we decided we would do a Facebook Live, and some folks looked at that and said, oh, you guys should do a podcast. And I wanted her to do it with me because she's wonderful she just has a wonderful presence about her, and we have fun doing it together. So going back to when I started doing couples therapy. So it was a year or two in, I think, 2 or 3 years, whatever. Early on in that practice, I was at a consultation group meeting, and a colleague, we were getting up to go. I don't even remember what we were talking about, probably couples therapy, I imagine. But we were getting up to go, and this colleague and friend of mine turned to me and said, how do you do couples therapy anyway? Which is sort of this, like, how am I supposed to answer that question, But I had actually given it a bit of thought. Because I was wondering that myself. I would just sort of, bounce that around. It's like, what the hell am I really doing here, And I realized if I boil it all down, essentially what I'm trying to convey to people is be kind and don't panic. And be kind, I don't just mean be nice. I mean, be kin, recognize your kinship. And you can't do that if you're in a panic. So, most of the techniques that we learn when you learn how to do this, when you're trained in zillions of different schools of therapy exist, right? Schools of thought about how to do this, but they all share the idea that you need to be able to talk about stuff without freaking out. You need to be able to go there to these potentially really anxiety-producing topics without freaking out. And so I'm realizing, be kind and don't panic. And I start sharing that with some of the couples I work with. And they would say, well, okay, how do you not panic? And they had me there. Because I'm thinking, dang, because be kind and don't panic is great. So how do we not panic? Because we all know what panic feels like. We are all wired to be able to panic. So I still don't really have a simple answer for how to not panic, but I gave it thought over a number of months, and I realized if I thought about the couples I worked with and just very loosely divide them into two camps, the couples that came in and you could just see they just were having a hard time. Those are the couples that would come in and say, let's say they were dealing with infidelity, which a substantial proportion of the couples I'm working with are close to half, I think, are dealing with infidelity or some similar kind of betrayal. And so they're coming in and they're freaking out, of course, understandably. And the person who did the cheating is, by the time they're in a therapist's office, they're feeling terrible about it. They've already been busted, so to speak. And the person who was cheated on is feeling angry and hurt and doubting their own sanity. And I mean, it's just a mess, understandably. That's sort of what it's like at first. The couples that come in and say, we just want to go back to how it was fine. The one who was cheated on will say, yeah, I'm pissed and I'm hurt, and we just have to make sure there are rules so that bastard will never do that again, And the one who did the cheating is saying, yeah, I'll never do it again. I must have been crazy. No, let's just go back. That is panic. That's just basically panic. You can't go back to how it was. And you shouldn't go back to how it was, because how it was is what got you in trouble. So clearly there was something going wrong. What it was varies from couple to couple, but there was something not working right. The couples that would come in, same sort of just really hurt state, but they would often say, and I'll quote especially, let's say, the one who was cheated on. And let's make her the woman this time again, too. And she says, I know he's not crazy. I know he's not evil. I've seen him. I believe him when he says he loves me even, but he cheated on me. We're going to have to understand what was going on. I know he's not a terrible person. Maybe I can trust him and maybe I can't. If I can't, I suppose I'll need to divorce him, but I want to understand. And the guy comes in, the guy who did the cheating, and he's saying, I can't just write this off as being crazy. I wasn't crazy. It's terrible. I feel terrible about doing it. It's almost like I found myself doing it, but we better understand it. That's faith. They have faith that there is meaning to be found even in suffering. There's meaning to be found even in bad behavior. That life is fundamentally right to be what it is, even when it sucks. So that created a 7-word formula for like what couples therapy is all about. And that's the title of the podcast my wife and I do is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. the 7 words. For those of you who are actually watching, I have it on a cup. Those are the 7 words. That's the logo for our. So that kind of going back, that took me a while to develop that concept, but that's what I've been working with. And people find that, again, that obviously doesn't answer all anybody's questions, but they find it's a useful structure. So I will often, it's funny, I'll structure things around, I mentioned earlier, those concepts of stability and intimacy. I'll usually give a little talk in a first session about stability and intimacy as these 2 sets of needs that are both needs, and yet they're somewhat in conflict. But the key in terms of what lets you experience intimacy is to tolerate anxiety. And the way to tolerate anxiety is faith. And again, I don't mean religious faith. I mean, I'm not ruling out religious faith, but I've known plenty of religious people who are not showing the kind of faith I'm talking about. They may be into like some sort of fundamentalist and very rigid ideas about the way things are, but they're not accepting the rightness of reality. They're not saying, well, we're going to have to understand this. They're thinking they already understand everything and they're just pissed. And that gets you nowhere. What I'm talking about is, again, I've known non-religious people to show this kind of faith. It's not the same as religious faith, but it is that sense that reality is right to be what it is. That's what will get people through this.
And now you mentioned for intimacy, you need to be able to tolerate anxiety.
And sometimes people will ask questions rather like you just said that. It's like, they'll sort of look at me quizzically like, wait a minute, I thought intimacy is supposed to feel good, right? When it does, doesn't it? Of course it does. Intimacy can be lovely. But of course, I'm not just talking about sex. Intimacy, in the way I define intimacy, sort of, loosely, is intimacy is when you are present and honest with yourself and each other. That's what I mean by intimacy. And intimacy, when you're having a lovely shared experience, be it sexual or otherwise, we have a lovely meal together or a lovely music experience together or seeing a beautiful sunset or whatever, those can feel lovely. That's not about anxiety. But intimacy also involves things like something as simple as a complaint. What if you want to complain? I don't mean that in a whiny sense. What if you just want to say, hey, I wish you would pick up your underwear, or whatever that might be. In issuing any sort of complaint to your partner, it's not going to be fun for them to hear. It's going to raise anxiety a little. Now, if it's something trivial, you can sort of laugh about it. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Sometimes it's not at all trivial. Sometimes it's like, wow, for example, wow, I think I might be gay, and we're in a heterosexual relationship. That to have the courage to bring that up is, and that's a very intimate moment, and yet it is hugely anxiety producing. Or even to say things about, I think I want us to move overseas for 6 months or something, and I'm worried that's going to freak you out if I suggest that. Or I want to open up a business, and I'm worried you're going to belittle me if I say that. And, all sorts of things that people might say about, or fantasies, again, in the sexual domain, especially. Somebody has some fantasies and they're worried that or even just desires or preferences, something they want to try, and they're worried their partner's going to think them weird for even wanting it. And if they have a history of conversations going off the rails when somebody says something that raises anxiety, that makes it even less likely they're willing to share that stuff. And what's happening then is intimacy is basically being compromised. I always like to use my favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy. If you think about a plant and, a seed gets planted in fertile soil and it germinates and it sprouts and starts to grow, then somebody comes along and paves the sidewalk over it. Well, that's for stability. That's for the use of people walking on it. It's more stable. But of course, what does it do to the plant? The plant has roots for stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. What that plant is going to do is crack the sidewalk or die trying. It won't tolerate just being paved over. It'll either crack the sidewalk or it will die trying to crack the sidewalk. And we've all seen, cracked sidewalks with plants growing through them. That's really powerful. So, it'll find a way through somehow. And so that, I call it a metaphor. I think there's something, I'm not sure it's only metaphorical. I think intimacy is pretty much that same process for any living organism. It wants to interact deeply with its environment. And a couple is a living organism also. So what happens when intimacy is compromised because people are avoiding it because they're too afraid, because it doesn't go well. What happens then is somebody or something tries to crack the sidewalk. Now, what does that look like in a couple? Sometimes it looks like an affair. It's not the only reason people have affairs, but it's one of them, is that there's no intimacy happening and they're starved for intimacy, so they become vulnerable to someone else's attentions. Again, not the only reason, but it's one of the biggies. Sometimes lack of intimacy looks like you can't talk about anything without getting into an argument. You argue about anything and nothing, and people will say, why are we so pissed off about such trivia? Well, often, not always, but often that is a indicator of compromised intimacy. Sometimes somebody blindsides the other and just says, I'm out of here, and they had no idea that was going to happen. All those sorts of things are the symptoms of compromised intimacy.
No, that makes a lot of sense about being able to tolerate anxiety, because to reach that deep level of intimacy, you've got to be able to talk about anything. And there's going to be some anxiety with certain things, even like you mentioned the move. You mentioned like even things that could happen, whether it's you want to go to school in like any slight change, it doesn't have to be the minuscule like the underwear, and it doesn't have to be as extreme like the heterosexual versus the lesbian, but like even something, like, and it can be nerve-wracking to bring up that conversation because it's a change, and change is hard, even if it's something both people want.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I talk about intimacy and stability, and I don't mean to downrate the importance of stability. I have met couples where they can have a great sex life and they can be really passionately involved, but they can't stay together for longer than, 3 weeks without splitting up or getting into huge arguments or things like that. Stability is important too. The skills are very different. The skills of stability are about the way I like to put it, the skills of stability are basically boring. They're really important, but they're boring. You have to be responsible and accountable and predictable and reliable. Those are really boring. They're really important, but they're really boring. Those are the skills that give you stability, because stability itself is pretty boring, right? I mean, it doesn't change much, but of course you need that to not be freaking out all the time. Nobody can be intimate 24/7. And so, if what couples will often tend to do is they will favor stability over intimacy because stability is a lot less scary. But of course, my whole thesis is that, intimacy turns out to be a need too. People don't tolerate lack of intimacy for very long.
Now, I'm curious. I want to transition a tad, but do you think every couple should go to couples therapy?
I've been asked that question a number of times. Short answer, no, I don't. It's funny. I was just writing about this in the book I'm working on. Should you be in couples therapy? And I'm saying, this is a book written by a couples therapist. You'd think I would say yes. I don't say yes, actually. I want to say this carefully because I don't want to be disrespectful to other people doing very good work, but I'm just so not interested in sitting with people while they're doing navel gazing, I mean, folks who want to work with someone so they can improve their life. It's just that part isn't fun for me. I want to work with people who really need help. I don't want to work with people who want to enrich their lives. There are people who do that. Go do that. Not me. I want to work with people who are in serious trouble that need serious help, like right away, because, they're not having to say, gee, I feel a little off. No, you don't feel a little off. You're in crisis and you're worried that your whole world's going to fall apart. Those are the folks I want to help. So, from that perspective, well, how did I get there from your question? Should everybody do, couples therapy? No, I like the sort of the family doctor model, When do you go to your family doctor? I mean, yes, I suppose you might go for checkups, right? Especially us old fogies. I have my Medicare checkup, my annual Medicare checkup coming fairly soon. But usually, you go to the doctor when something's bothering you. And you go and you get help, and ideally they figure out something to help you not be bothered, then you don't go back. I mean, maybe they check to make sure it's okay, but then you don't just keep going and going and going. That's how I tend to view going to therapy of any kind. Really useful. And so when I work with couples, I don't say, well, you have to do a course of X number of sessions and then you're done. No, I'll work. I don't ask people at the end of the session. I don't say, when would you like to meet again? I say, would you like to meet again? And sometimes every once in a while, somebody when they are not used to that, they'll look at me funny and say, well, don't you think we should? And I'll say, no, of course. I just want to make it clear. It's always up to you. I'm always focusing on people on that question. In fact, the very first question I ask people routinely is, how will you know if this is helping? And that focuses them right off. It's like, yeah, it is your responsibility as the person using my services to decide for yourself, is this helping? And of course, with a couple, it's fascinating because they don't always agree on that. So there are three different opinions, mine and the two of them, about does it seem to be helping or not. Of course, of those three, mine, I think, arguably is the least important one. But I have my own opinions too. But so you can't always tell. Sometimes people will say, well, what's your success rate? Well, it depends on who's defining success. I've worked with some couples where one of them ends up saying, oh my God, this has so helped me clarify. I know I need to get out of this relationship. That's really sad. And the other is thinking, I was hoping this was going to save our relationship and, you've blown it. So who's right? Well, both of them. I'm not going to say either one of them is right. Those are valid, those are valid opinions. So, all of that by way of saying, no, I don't think every couple ought to be in couples therapy. I've met with couples where they'll set up a session for 6 months down the line, just sort of as a little check-in, but they don't usually do that very many times. If they've done a bunch of work, they've recovered from some serious pain that they've been having, and they'll sometimes set up something later. And those are nice sessions because they'll just talk about how things are going well. And that's lovely when that happens.
Mm. Now, I'm curious if you have, and obviously this would just be your opinion, but like as a couples therapist, when a couple would realize that like maybe they should try couples therapy?
I mean, if there's a few contraindications, right? Clear contraindications. If there is serious violence happening, if there's somebody at risk of physical harm, there's no way they should be in couples therapy. It's dangerous. It's simply dangerous. You have to, it's not that I want people to piss each other off, but you have to be safe if you do. So there's that. That's a contraindication. Another one that I just have no fun working with is if it's mandated or if they're in the middle of an adversarial proceeding. If they're in court as adversaries, I won't work with them that way. It tends not to be very useful. What they need is mediation, not a therapist. Now, occasionally I've worked with folks who have canceled their divorce application or whatever filing because they want to actually explore getting back together. I'm happy to work with them. Or people who know they're divorcing and they're not fighting about it. They just want some help, helping them divorce in a way that is more humane for themselves and their kids. Happy to work with that too. But I'm not going to work with them as part of an adversarial proceeding. If those things aren't the case, then one sort of seat of the pants way of deciding, maybe couples therapy is a good idea is if you keep trying to have the same damn conversation and it never goes well. Couples therapy can be very helpful with that. Because, what is my job there? There's a couple different ways I could say it. I already mentioned, the chief thing I probably offer more than anything else, according to my own little construction, is faith. I'm sitting there saying, you're both valid people. Me too. We're all valid people in this conversation. Doesn't matter, we've all screwed up in one way or another. I'm not saying that's the same, but I'm just saying, we're all valid people. We're all imperfect people. We're doing the best we can here. Let's work with that. I start with the assumption that nobody involved is crazy, evil, or stupid. We're all of those things occasionally, but in general, the people I work with aren't crazy. Everyone's in 30 years, how many times would I say this? 4 or 5 times in 30 years, I've met a couple where I wouldn't say, oh, one thing you've got going for you is neither one of you is batshit crazy. When I'm talking about stability, I usually say, you seem to have one thing going for you. You're not nuts, and they'll laugh. And I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues, but they're not psychotic. They're not in the middle of a manic episode. It's not that sort of thing. Every once in a while, I have met a couple or an individual where that is the case, so I wouldn't say that. But the overwhelming, and sometimes they think the other one is crazy. And that, and I'm making it sound sort of funny, and I don't mean it in the funny way. I mean, they'll think the other one that, they'll go online and diagnose the person. Well, I have a narcissist, or I have a borderline, or I have a fill in the blank, and it's not that those are completely useless terms, but they are also bludgeons. They close down the conversation instead of opening it up. So they may think each other crazy, but I don't. And I start with that assumption. So they're getting faith from me. But the other thing they're getting, which is sort of associated with that, is they're getting a relatively calm nervous system compared to theirs. So they're in a conversation with someone who is genuinely curious, genuinely cares about them, because I care about all the people I work with, genuinely curious, not condemning them and not freaking out. And, on those rare occasions over the past 30 years where I have come close to freaking out, I haven't been very helpful to people. And that's one of the things I think with experience I've gotten better at. I've gotten better at not freaking out. I'll hear about something, or I'll hear, it's especially, this is a classic, especially some guy who's being sort of a jerk. And I know what it's like to be a guy. And unfortunately, I know what it's like to be a jerk. And so, you know what I mean? This is a classic for therapists, the stuff in ourselves we don't like. And so I would sort of start feeling really condemning of that guy who's being a jerk. And because I recognize it, too much. I've gotten better at that. I don't think I'm any less prone to being arrogant or whatever. I just am less prone to condemning it in other people. So I can generally work with folks now more lightly. So that, again, long answer to your question, but yeah, the time to go is if you keep finding there's stuff you just can't get past certain conversations and you'd like to be able to. Those are often good ideas to go to couples therapy. Now, what happens when you go to couples therapy, if your couples therapist proceeds to say, oh, you need to communicate better and teaches you rules for communication, here's my controversial statement, undoubtedly overstated, but the title of my second book was, It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. That's a snarky title. But what I mean by that is if you go, if I start teaching people, oh, use I statements, not you statements, you probably heard of that, right? Everybody's heard of that, or most people have, of course. It's not a bad idea. It's not a terrible idea. Or active listening, repeat back to the person and make sure you understood what, those aren't bad ideas at all. But if you use them as techniques instead of, what those are, when I statements and active listening and stuff like that is, what those are is if you are a fly on the wall watching a happy couple talk to each other, you will observe that there's very informally, they're not formally doing that, but informally they're doing that. If they're having a conversation about something you disagree about, check out John Gottman's work on that. He did enormous amount of research, still doing it, on couples and what makes it work, in terms of when they have a conversation about something they disagree about. If you are a fly on the wall watching a happy couple, you would observe, indeed, they are sort of active listening. They're making, they're trying to really genuinely understand what the other person's saying. They're not calling each other names, all of those things are good ideas. If you teach those as rules to people who aren't happy, it won't make them happy. They'll just argue about how they're not following the rules. Or they won't be able to follow the rules because they're too freaked out. Or they'll be every bit as contemptuous with an I statement as with a you statement. So those techniques don't help. They're just ridiculously cumbersome and they make people think they're helping, but actually all they do really is give you something to do while you're not being intimate, while you're not being honest with each other. But my point, and the reason I'm, reason I wrote a book with that provocative title, is to point out, it's like, what analogy did I use? As I recall, I'm not much of a tennis player. I used to play with my kids when they were in high school. You know how the real top tennis players, they'll grunt loudly when they hit the ball? So I guess they should give grunting lessons in tennis so that you grunt loudly and that makes you, that turns me into Rafael Nadal, right? No, it doesn't. Probably the grunting has something, there probably is some correlation between the grunting and them being top players, but it's not the grunting. It's the being a top player. Maybe that's associated with the grunting. So couples that are communicating, following those rules informally, they're doing it because they're happy. They're not happy because they're doing it. And teaching those rules won't make them happy.
Mm.
There was what's the name of I know what it was. The Four Seasons. I don't know if you would know the film that came out. It was probably 30 years ago, at least, with Alan Alda and Carol Burnett. But just recently they made a miniseries on one of the streaming services based on the same plot, basically, The Four Seasons. It was Tina Fey was in the Carol Burnett role. I forgot who was in the Alan Alda role. Anyway, they did this really hilarious send-up of one of the main couples who had obviously been to couples therapy, and they had been taught these communication techniques. And so they would switch into that mode and communicate with, I need a moment. Oh, and then they would switch into the mode and do their thing. And it was obvious they were actually getting nowhere, but they had learned the technique. I thought it was great.
Okay.
It's not that communication won't help at all. A happy couple is communicating well. And it's a very small percentage of the couples I see that actually do need help with communication. They're the people who are on the autistic spectrum. In other words, there are some folks who, for example, what they used to call Asperger's, and they did away with that as a formal diagnosis because it was too vague. It wasn't specific enough. But one of the characteristics for a lot of folks who get that label Asperger's is they have a hard time reading someone else's emotions. They don't know how to read. That's a communication problem. And that causes all sorts of difficulties. So they need actual training in communication. And there are folks who do that, can help folks who are in that situation. And I suppose I could say, yes, every once in a while I've met a couple where only one of them, if they're seeing me, at least one of them speaks English because that's the only language I'm fluent in. So one of them speaks English, the other doesn't have much English yet. So they're having communication problems. And sometimes it's cultural, even if they're both fluent in English. Sometimes there are cultural communication issues that are interesting. Oh, you thought that was a compliment, or you thought that was an insult, but in my culture, that's a compliment, that sort of thing. That can happen. Those are communication issues. That's not the bulk of the folks that I work with, though. Even the folks that do come from different cultures, they figured that stuff out long since. That's not the stuff they're having trouble with. No, the problem they're having, it's not how they communicate. The problem is what they are communicating. If what they are communicating is respect and love and consideration and deference and curiosity, how they communicate will follow from that. If what they are communicating is contempt and anger and mistrust, you can teach them rules all day long and they're still going to be communicating that. So the issue that will help them isn't how to frame your contempt so it doesn't sound so bad. That's not going to help. The issue is, gee, how come you're contemptuous? And I don't mean that I don't even mean that to sound like it's a tut-tut sort of, you shouldn't be contemptuous. It's like, no, seriously, you sound contemptuous. Think about that. Like, what's that about? Where's that from? It could be that they're sounding contemptuous because they're really angry and they haven't been able to notice its anger. Or one of my favorite stories is a couple that came in. I actually tell this in that book. A couple that came in, we'd had 5 or 6 sessions, something like that. We'd have a few sessions talking about a lot of the same stuff. And they had actually listened to some of our podcasts. They were doing the work. Their presenting problem was that anytime the husband would make a suggestion to the wife about something he thought she could be doing better or differently, and she would either often clam up, or she would feel terrible, clam up, or lash out or something. They couldn't figure out, what's wrong here. So we had a few sessions, and they came in at that 6th or 7th session, and they were just both beaming. They were both delighted. I'm saying, gee, what are you so happy about? What's going on? And the guy said, well, went back and thought about stuff we've been working on. I realized I do think she's a moron. So he's smiling, right? Saying that, right? You think he's smiling? What kind of a jerk is this? She's smiling. Now, why are they both smiling? Well, because what he means by that is he's saying, look, I know perfectly well she's not a moron. I know she's intelligent. She's at least as intelligent as I am. I know that. But I realized that when I would make my suggestions, the reason she was responding the way she was isn't because I wasn't framing it correctly. It's because I was genuinely being condescending. I genuinely thought at that moment I know better than she does. I wasn't actually giving her credit for being intelligent. This took some soul searching on his part to figure that out. And he had to not be dissolved in shame. Now, why is she smiling? You think she could be mad as hell, she's smiling because she said, well, first of all, I'm glad he figured that out. That really is a relief. It means I wasn't overreacting. It's like, no, the reason I was reacting is he really was being condescending. Neither one of us knew it. The reason she didn't know it, she said, it's because I agreed with him. I thought I was a moron too. Now she knows better than that too, but she had absorbed that from her childhood. She had often been put down a lot especially by men and, by father and brother. And so she was used to being accused of being an idiot. And so she didn't know to say, wait a minute, you're treating me like I'm an idiot here. If she could have done that, they could have confronted this a long time ago, but she couldn't. And he didn't know it because we as men, like here I am talking to a woman, mansplaining to you about what men do to women, right? Here you go, right? And, and we don't know it. We really, I'm speaking for all men here, right? No, we mean well, usually, most of us are totally jerks, but we are often, as many, many women have informed me, we are often actually quite condescending, that the whole concept of mansplaining, and there's a basis for that. And when we start to get it, if we don't dissolve in shame and if we don't get pissed off about it, we start to get it's like, oh shit, that's what's going on. So they didn't need communication. That he just needed to realize, oh, geez, if I'm not condescending, maybe she'll listen. And the wonderful thing about that was once they figured that out, he could then make any suggestion he wanted. And he wasn't doing it in a condescending way. He was just saying, hey, I have an idea. And she would listen and agree or not agree. And it didn't matter. They were both freed up by that. It wasn't this sort of thing, this hidden thing where she was constantly being put down and neither one of them realized it.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's not how, but it's what.
And that's not so simple, right? That doesn't yield to, oh, let's learn some techniques here. That yields. How do you get at that? You have to, first of all, accept it as worthy of investigations. Like, well, gee, why did you cheat? Or why do you think she's a moron? Or what is that about? Where did it come from? Not, especially like the why did you cheat thing. It's like, there's a thin line between blaming the victim and looking at context. And the couple that is willing to look at context and not go into blaming the victim, they're the ones who can actually make some progress on that. But they're going to have to figure that out. The only way you're going to be able to trust each other again is if you really have an understanding of what happened, that, where you can say, it's possible that a decent person could have done that. They shouldn't have, but I can sort of see how he or she could have done that. I wish they hadn't, but we know better now. But yeah, I see how the circumstances were such that you were susceptible to that. And then they can get past some of the anger and then they can figure out, okay, well, can I actually come to trust this person? Can we understand this enough that I can actually trust this person enough to want to stay with them?
Now, do you think there's any couples that couples therapy won't help?
Well, it depends on what you mean by help. In the sense that there are plenty of couples where couples therapy will not result in their wanting to stay together, because there are some couples, and it's like, no, you guys should split up. It's like, no wonder you're miserable. You've got all kinds of good reason that you're miserable. You'll be better off if you split up, So couples therapy can actually help that. But it's the ones that are harder to help are the ones, again, this is a broad overgeneralization, but the ones who come in and aren't showing that kind of faith I was talking. The ones who just want to deny reality. It's like, we just want to go back to how it was. That's kind of the paradigm there. Couples therapy isn't going to help them much, but they have to be willing to look at what happened without sort of preconceived ideas of what things must be. And that's the therapist too, by the way. If the therapist, and we are all susceptible to it, and anybody's line of work is susceptible to it. If I get too fond of my own, brilliant ideas, I'm not going to be helpful. If I think I know, that's, that was that snarky subtitle, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. That applies to me too. If I think I know right off before we get started, I know, or now I've got you diagnosed. I know what this is about. I'm not going to be helpful.
Now, you mentioned for the couples that want to go back to how it was, like couples therapy isn't really going to do anything for them. Now, is that only for the couples that something has happened?
Look, the title of my first book was Reigniting the Spark, It's like, yeah, the implication there is, indeed, there are couples who say, wow, we used to just be so passionately in love. We've lost that. Can we get that back? Well, absolutely. I'm not saying they can absolutely get it back. I'm saying that's a worthy thing to work on. Yes, sometimes they can. Sometimes, it's never the same as what it was because we're not the same as we were however many years ago. Nobody is. We've had life in between. We've grown, we've learned, we've changed, that's inevitable. But that doesn't mean they can't find that really intense spark. It's something of a myth that, people will say, well, that novelty stuff always wears off. And different people will say it's based on the particular neurochemicals involved. They'll say 18 months, sometimes maybe 2 years, then it's a slog, then it's work, that just sounds so dismal to me. It doesn't have to be. Again, I'm not saying every couple can have that, but there are certainly many couples, and I don't mind saying I'm in one, frankly, where the passion has ever been as strong as it was on day one. It's different because we're, 22 years older and have known each other that long, but it's every bit as intense. And in fact, we keep learning more and more about each other. That's all about intimacy. That is about not freaking out at intimacy. And we both my wife and I benefit from having been in marriages that didn't work, saying nothing bad about our exes, but we benefited from those experiences. We learned a lot. Both came into knowing each other way more equipped to handle intimacy than we were either of us in our first marriage.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense when you mentioned about how you're not the same people. Like, even if not something like, because I was mainly thinking about infidelity, because even though I'm not a couples therapist, like you hear all the time, like even from friends and even from people I've known, and I used to be a paralegal in a family law office. Like, we just want to go back before the infidelity happened. And so I was honestly just curious even if that thing didn't happen and maybe they just feel like they're not connecting, but they're different people.
You are and you're not, both. Do you know what I mean? And I'm a sucker for good paradoxes, and so much of the work, in fact, one of the things I've said in this most recent book is the most important skill you will ever learn is the ability to accept contradictory truths, which of course is very different from what you get in a law office. In a law office, you're going to slug it out and you're going to find the truth, or at least find who wins. And I'm sure that's an unfair caricature of law offices, but whatever. And it's funny. I have a lot of respect, even as a couples therapist, a lot of respect for lawyers and the law, because what it offers people is a huge incentive to try and not freak out. Because what they'll realize is if they're too rigid, some judge will, quote unquote, decide for them. They'll say, well, here's your solution. And it may not be a solution either one of them likes, or it may be a solution one likes and the other doesn't, which doesn't work. I was once, I guess I was not an intern anymore, newly in practice, but I went to a continuing education event, and it was a psychologist presenting this protocol that she had developed for working with high conflict couples. And she was sort of proudly presenting this protocol she'd worked, and she used an example. Now, of course, she changed names, right? You have to do that for confidentiality. But the agreement she passed out, I recognized immediately because I had worked with the family. And so I'd seen the agreement. I knew the psychologist who had done this work with this family didn't know this, because she was done when they signed the agreement. I knew that literally the father had violated the agreement. He was already threatening his ex with legal action, when what they had just signed an agreement to do was not to do that. It had failed miserably. The person who had developed the protocol had no idea. I didn't tell her that would be violating confidentiality on my part, but she had no idea. And I realized, people will do these things when they do these sorts of either mediation or psychological assessments are like this a lot. If someone does an assessment, they have no idea what the effect of the assessment was. They're done when they're done with the assessment. that actually turns out often to have bad effects. Maybe good effects occasionally, often bad effects.
I don't remember. It's so bad.
I'm 74 years old.
Different people, but they're also not different people, like going back to how things were, but like,
Yeah.
I get what you mean by they're not different people, but they are a little bit, even if a little bit of time has passed, like even if we think about ourselves individually, like we're different than we were 6 months ago, interests, hobbies, things we do, how we show up, even if it's little things like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when a couple is doing well, that becomes part of what's exciting. They don't expect to remain constant because nobody does. That's a reality. That's an element of faith. It's like, well, of course we all change. So it just becomes an element of, there's always new things to discover. And also there's an element, I think, in couples that do well in monogamy. That one of the things I've noted over the years is that there are some folks, and I don't mean this in any judgmental way, there's some folks that just don't like monogamy. That's one of the reasons people cheat. I mentioned the one about, there's contextual problems in the main relationship often, but often you will hear people say, no, I totally love my spouse and we have a great sex life and we have a great life. And, but I just couldn't resist, exploring this other person, they're just sort of not cut out for monogamy or don't really believe in it or something like that. So I have met folks like that. And if you like monogamy, and I happen to like it, and again, it's clearly not for everybody, but I like it a lot. And, what I like about monogamy, people who like monogamy, I think, and this is what I was starting to say in terms of, what will keep people together when they're monogamous. It's that they will view monogamy not as a restriction, but as a gift. There is a level of intimacy, I think, one can have in monogamy that you can't have any other way. And it has a lot to do with the fact of knowing somebody over a long period of time and going through changes together and going through crises together and going through joys together. There's something about that is a level of intimacy, if you can tolerate it. Because again, a lot of times people in long-term relationships, it feels too risky to try something new. It feels too risky to be actually honest with your partner because stability is so important. But if you can, there's a intimacy you can achieve that way, I think, that isn't like anything else. Now, what do I know? I'm only on one side of that. As I say, I like monogamy. That's, I've been monogamous in each of my 2 marriages. I think I'm sort of wired that way.
I get what you mean though, by like some people, man or woman, just aren't wired that way. Like even working in the family law office, I've met men and women like they just wanted to be with somebody else. They've been in the marriage this long, but it was just something they had a desire to do.
Yeah. I've seen that. I'm sure that there have always been people like that. There's probably less of the social stigma around that than there used to be. And similarly, marriage is not what it used to be. It ain't what it used to be, but it isn't in a lot of ways. The statistics on who gets married, that's changed a lot. In some countries in Europe, it's well over half of the women having children aren't married to the father of the child. And many of them are, in fact, partnered with the father of the child. It's not like they're casual relationships, but they have chosen not to get married. And that's, in this country, it's approaching half. I think close to half of the kids born now, their mother is not married. Wow. I'm old enough to remember when there was, that's, oh my God, a child born out of wedlock. Of course it happened. Obviously it happened, but there was stigma associated with it. And it happened a lot less. And now there is virtually no social stigma associated. And I'm not saying there should be, I'm just observing. So one effect of that is marriage itself has kind of gone out of style.
I have noticed that myself as well. I'm a lot younger, but I noticed like on the tail end, like I had relatives in my life and in my family that like when the first child that was born out of wedlock, nobody was going to that baby shower because she was supposed to be married and she wasn't married. And I still remember it. And it was me, my mom and I went, but there were so many family members that like did not go to this. And because the child was born out of wedlock and it was just not something they wanted to endorse, I guess, wanted to accept. So,
it's still around, but it's kind of quaint, it depends on which particular sort of subculture you're talking about. This is a big country. There are plenty of very traditional folks of different traditions that would be a big stigma about it. but kind of mainstream. Like when I was a kid, you would never see a celebrity where they would say, oh, so-and-so is pregnant and the father is her fiance. They would never say that, ever. Now that's kind of the rule. That's the norm.
Now, Bruce, I've got a question for you, a little bit off topic, but a lot of people have experienced multiples of these in their life, but I'm curious what you would say the biggest aha moment was you experienced in your life.
Oh, wow. Well, so there's aha moments, and there's another one that I like to talk about called the oh shit moment, which is a relative of the aha moment. So I want to talk about both of those if I may. It's one of my favorite topics, actually, because the aha moments, I've experienced little aha moments. I used to be a math major for a while, before I was an East Asian Studies major, I was a math major. And, you get aha moments, that feeling that, math can do that for you, you wouldn't think. But other aha moments in my life, maybe an aha moment when I figured out, oh, wow, I really want to be doing this work. That was kind of an aha moment. But a cousin of an aha moment is the oh shit moment. The oh shit moment is when you realize, oh shit, that's what's happening here. It's not an aha because you haven't solved the problem, but it is a moment. It can be an oh shit moment with a couple, can be deeply intimate. They haven't solved the problem. That's why it's an oh shit moment, not an aha moment. Aha moments are great. Aha moments like, oh, that's what you want? I didn't realize. Oh, well, no problem. I'm happy. Let's do it that way. That's an aha moment. Those are lovely. That's great. But the oh shit moment is like, oh shit, that's what you're worried about. I have many, many examples of this, but one of them is I actually have a chapter in the book, particularly aimed at women, because this is very much gendered this way, not exclusively, but very much gendered this way. How do you get your reluctant guy to go to therapy? Because it's women who want to do couples therapy and men don't. Now is that always true? No, of course not. But overwhelmingly it's a big percentage that way. And so there's lots and lots of women that are trying to convince lots and lots of guys to go to couples therapy. And I hear about it. There they are in couples therapy. And I often hear about it, because I'll say, what precipitated your coming? Why now? And very often part of the story will be, he will say, well, she's been trying to get me to go for the last 5 years, but I haven't seen the need. Or she'll say, I've been trying to get him to go for the last 5 years, but he keeps refusing. So how do you get him to go? Well, my basic thesis about that is the reason we as men resist it is we give all sorts of reasons that often really annoy women for good reason, I think. If you're the one who has the problem, you should go. Or, therapy is for crazy people or stupid people or weak people, or all of those sorts of things. Meanwhile, the woman is thinking, he doesn't care enough about me. I'm saying we're having a problem. He doesn't care enough about me to go. She's thinking he doesn't care. And all of those reasons are missing what I think is really the main point, which is the reason that we as men resist is that we are terrified. It's not that we don't care, it's that we do care. And we are terrified that if we go to couples therapy with the woman in our lives, we will lose her. We will lose the relationship. Why do we think that? Well, because we have good reason to think it, because that happens a lot. And we go to couples therapy, they end up splitting up. The guy will think, well, that's much more women's territory than men's territory, because it is. And I say that as a male therapist, but it is. Women want to talk about this stuff way more than men do. Many women can talk rings around men when it comes to talking about emotional stuff, have much better understanding. So the guy feels at a huge disadvantage. And he's worried that the therapist is going to say or imply to the woman, why are you with a jerk like this? Because sometimes he is a jerk. So all of those reasons, he's got really good reason to be afraid, but he's not saying that because being guys, we don't want to say we're afraid, especially to women, but really to anybody. We don't want to say it, but we don't want to know it. We refuse to admit it to ourselves, but we're terrified. So the oh shit moment comes in. If the woman can actually say, wait a minute, I know you're not crazy. I know you do care about me. What is wrong? What are you worried about? What is your worry if we went to therapy? If she says that with, not to try to wheedle him into going, but if she says that with actual curiosity, it's like, wait a second. I'll bet you're afraid of this. And for good reason. I don't think you're crazy. It's like, what's worrying you? Then the guy will often say, yeah, I'm worried they're going to split us up. And then she might say, yeah, I'm worried about that too. It's like, oh shit, that's the oh shit moment. It's not that they agree. It's that they suddenly have this moment of saying, she's saying their thing. Oh shit. That's why he's been, such a jerk about this. He's not a jerk. He's scared. And he's saying, oh shit. First of all, with any luck, he's saying, I've been kind of a jerk about this. You hope he's saying that. But also he's saying, oh shit, she's worried about it too. We're not as far apart as I thought we were. She's not just trying to drag me in and put me down. She's worried too. That's an oh shit moment. So the purpose of therapy, here's an overstatement. The purpose of therapy is to bring about oh shit moments so that they can, because they're moments where they're not fighting at that point. They're not necessarily, they haven't solved the problem. If they solve the problem, it's aha. But there's, oh shit, that's what's happening here. We better look at this. That's faith, right? It's like, oh, in other words, this isn't just that you're being horrible. This is that you have reason to be that way that I hadn't realized. And I can kind of relate to it. Let's figure this out. That's an oh shit moment.
Mm. So what was the biggest oh shit moment you've had in your life?
Oh, when my then wife said she's figured out that, well, I'll just she basically figured out she's gay.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a huge oh shit moment. But it was like, and it's kind of my paradigmatic oh shit moment, but it is one where on the one hand, it was painful. On the other hand, it was an enormous relief because it was finally an explanation. I said this earlier. It was finally an explanation that neither one of us was broken. So that's oh shit moments could be like that. Yeah. That oh shit moment led to us splitting up. I would say happily splitting. I mean, it wasn't easy, but we're both a lot happier now. Some oh shit moments lead to reconciliation or lead to, oh, wow, I think we can understand this. Let's work with this. And they can actually find each other again. And that's really beautiful when that happens.
Wow. No, that makes a lot of sense. I really liked that comparison, the cousin to the aha moment. I have never heard that in my life, but I really liked that. I might start asking guests about both. I liked that a lot.
Yes. Feel free. Yes. That's, I think I made it up. I don't recall reading it anywhere, but anyway, it's out there for people to use. So
I'll reference you. I like that. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. I've enjoyed this and it's great.
Me too. Now, have you heard of a man named Jay Shetty?
Not immediately. Why? Maybe. Let's put it that way. I don't immediately recognize it, but maybe. I don't know. Tell me about it.
So he's got a podcast. He's written some books, and he's got a podcast called On Purpose. And he ends it with 2 segments, and I use those 2 segments. They're not mine. You don't have to know him to be able to answer the questions, but they are not my questions, and they are specifically from his show. So I give him credit before I ask these. The first segment is called The Many Sides to Us. There's 5 questions, and they need to be answered in 1 word each.
Oh, boy. Okay.
What is 1 word someone who is meeting you for the first time would use to describe you as?
Nerdy.
What is 1 word that someone who knows you extremely well would use to describe you as?
Thoughtful.
What is 1 word you'd use to describe yourself?
I use the same word.
No.
Caring.
That's a synonym, but that works. What is 1 word that if someone didn't like you or agree with your mindset would use to describe you as?
Arrogant.
What is 1 word that you're trying to embody right now?
Faith.
Second segment is the final 5, and these can be answered in up to a sentence. What is the best advice you've heard or received?
Oh, wow. Best advice I've heard or received. Oh, this is so hackneyed. And I don't even believe it, but I'll say it anyway. Follow your bliss. Though I deconstruct the hell out of that one, but follow your bliss.
Why is that the best if you don't believe it?
Because there's elements of it that are incredibly important. I think of that when I won't get into all the details at this point, but some moments in my life where I made decisions that were difficult and kind of risky. And it's that element of follow your bliss that I was following in that, even though, as I say, I could reject a lot of the narcissism involved in that concept, but that notion of saying, follow your heart, follow what really matters to you. That's kind of the idea. And I have received that as advice on occasion.
What is the worst advice you've heard or received?
The worst advice I've heard or received. Wow. The worst advice I've heard or received. You can always find the answer if you look hard enough.
Why is that the worst?
Because you can't. And thinking you can leads to all, that I was saying earlier about how a hugely important skill is to be able to accept contradictory truths. Thinking you can always find the one, that's fundamentalism. It's bad advice.
So you don't think you can always find the answer?
No, I think you can always find answers.
But not the answer.
You can never find the answer. You can find answers that work well. You sometimes can find one answer that really works well. But if you think you're finding the answer, you're part of the problem, not the solution.
If you think you're finding the answer, you're part of the problem and not the solution.
Yeah.
Because there's multiple answers.
Because there are always multiple answers. Now, some math problems, maybe not so much. Although even math is fascinating if you get into, that's how non-Euclidean geometries happen. Somebody said, what if we question the parallel postulate? And out came all this really useful, what turned out to be useful stuff. At first they thought was ridiculous, turned out to be useful. Imaginary numbers, they first thought they were ridiculous, turned out to be useful. Things like that. No, you don't always, life is more complex than any one understanding of it. That's kind of an article of faith.
What is something that you used to value that you no longer value?
Well, this is too cheap after what I just said, but it's like the quest for the one answer. I think the reason I'm so, strident about that is I think I used to think there was one. That's a cheap shot, right? That was a cheap shot. My wife and I were playing ping pong and we're not keeping score, and somebody, just sort of hits one back easy that the other person's one was out. It hits back easy and somebody slams that one. That's a cheap shot.
If you could describe what you would want your legacy to be as if someone was reading it, what would you want it to say?
Again, too easy because I've got my little 7-word formula, be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
But if it had to say something else and it couldn't say that, what would you want it to say?
I would want it to say, so it's something that people would remember me saying or promulgating or something like that?
Yeah, your legacy, if somebody was talking about you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would want it to say what he taught was that we need to recognize that even if we disagree, we're not crazy. The other side isn't crazy. We need to recognize there are multiple understandings that could be simultaneously valid even when there's someone opposite. That would be it.
I love that. I think that is so key, even outside of couples. Like
very much outside of couples. There's an organization called Braver Angels. They were formed in 2016. And one of the founders is, in fact, a couples therapist, Bill Doherty. But they organize groups all across the country where people on, the red states and blue states, or, you sort of self-identify as red, blue, or purple, very, very loosely. And they get people talking respectfully across real differences. Mm-hmm. And I find that incredibly inspiring. It's really the same thing.
If you could create one law in the world that everyone had to follow, what would it be? And I want to know why.
Yeah, one law that everyone had to follow. I mean, there's the snarky moments when I'm thinking, no one should be allowed to put deceptive stuff in their emails or in their snail mail envelopes. But that's just snarky. One law for everyone to follow is humility is be humble in your beliefs. In other words, that's not exactly a law, is it? That's not exactly a piece of legislation, but I could have said that in response to the previous question too. Be humble in your beliefs. In other words, nobody knows It's the knowing. It's the thinking you know. It's don't be ideological. Ideas open people up. Ideologies shut them down. So I would, it's so oxymoronic to say it. I would outlaw ideology, which is hilarious because that's an ideological thing to do. But I would outlaw the ideology and say, no, you can have lots of ideas and talk about them as ideas, but thinking you have the answer, no, I would outlaw the answer.
Okay. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me on. I had a lot of fun.
Me too. And no pressure, but I do just like to give it back to the guests. Any final words of wisdom you want to share?
My 7 words, be kind, don't panic, and have faith, is kind of queued up for that. So that's how I usually answer that question. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And, and that's just an opening. Think about that and see where it leads you, because that's really what's important. It's, those words themselves don't solve anything, but it's a guide to think about those 3 principles and see where they.
I love that. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Thank you so much, Bruce. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of Manders Mindset. In case no one told you today, I'm proud of you. I'm rooting for you. And you got this. As always, if you enjoyed the show, I would really appreciate it if you would leave me a 5-star rating, leave a review, and share it with anyone you think would benefit from this. And don't forget, you are only one mindset shift away from shifting your life. Thanks, guys. Until next time.